Okay, so it's April, and everyone's talking about April 2nd. Like it's going to be a big day, and especially for American farmers and like the whole Indian market thing.
Yeah, it's interesting what's happening with all this talk about India maybe changing their tariffs. Former President Trump said that they're about to drop their tariffs in a big way, and it just makes you wonder, why didn't this happen before?
Right. It's like all this stuff is like it's all happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Trump says this about India, and then the U.S. is getting ready to put in place what they're calling these reciprocal tariffs. It feels like things are really shifting, in global trade.
It does feel like we're at kind of a turning point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. So for everyone out there who's keeping up with all of this, whether you're, dealing with all the ins and outs of international trade or just trying to make sense of all the economic news, or even if you're just curious about how this global trade stuff works, this whole situation with India is really important. I mean, the big question is India really about to lower these tariffs, especially the ones that are hitting our farmers so hard? And what's really behind this possible change?
Yeah. That's the million-dollar question. And
Yeah.
to get to the bottom of it, you really have to look at it from the perspective of these reciprocal tariffs that the U.S. keeps talking about. The basic idea is that the United States has been dealing with what they see as unfair trade practices from other countries for a long time.
Right. And they're saying that April 2nd is when things might finally start to even out, like another reset in how trade works.
Exactly. It could be a huge shift.
Yeah. And, to show how off balance things are, they brought up the European Union and their car tariffs. The idea was that the EU recently dropped their tariffs on cars down to like 2.5%,
Mm.
which is a lot lower than what the U.S. has.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we need to dig a bit deeper into that, though. Trade agreements can be pretty complex, and there are usually a lot of different conditions and time frames involved depending on the specific goods and the countries. It's not always as simple as saying that the EU just dropped all their car tariffs to 2.5% across the board. You got to look at the details.
I hear you on that. So it wasn't just a random comment either. The White House is really pushing this narrative. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt even used a chart to show India's 100% tariff on American agricultural products. That's a pretty clear message.
Yeah, using that 100% figure was definitely a strategic move. When you hear that number, it immediately sounds like a wall that's impossible to get through. Leavitt's argument was basically that this tariff makes it practically impossible for American agricultural products to even get into the Indian market, which she says has been hurting American businesses and jobs for a long time.
And they didn't just stop with India either. They brought up the EU's 50% tariff on our dairy products. Japan's crazy 700% tariff on rice,
Yeah.
700%, and Canada's almost 300% tariff on butter and cheese.
Yeah.
Kind of feels like American farmers are fighting an uphill battle in a lot of these international markets.
For sure. And using all these specific examples definitely makes their point stronger. They're saying that if other big economies are putting these huge tariffs on American goods, then the United States has every right and maybe even a responsibility to do the same thing, to level the playing field and protect its own interests. Leavitt said that it's time for a president to take historic change, to do what's right for the American people, which really shows how serious they are about this.
It really does. So this brings us to the big mystery.
Yeah.
What exactly are these reciprocal tariffs that are supposed to go into effect on April 2nd? The White House hasn't given us many details. Leavitt said that the president will make the official announcement, but the message is clear. These measures are all about making sure American businesses are treated fairly in global trade.
Yeah, keeping the specifics under wraps is a classic negotiating tactic. When you don't let the other side know exactly what you're planning, it creates uncertainty, which might make them more willing to compromise. Plus, it makes a bigger impact when you finally do announce what you're going to do. It's a way of showing that you're serious without revealing all your cards too early.
It definitely gets people's attention. So going back to the whole India situation, Trump mentioned that he has a whole team of advisors who are focusing on this, like a special task force for trade. He specifically mentioned Howard Lutnick, Scott Bessent, Jameson Greer, Peter Navarro, Kevin Hassett, and the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor. Plus, he said Vice President J.D. Vance is involved too. So it seems like they're really focused on this particular trade issue.
And that group of advisors is really interesting because they all come from different backgrounds. Some are from finance, some from trade negotiation, some from economic policy. Some are known for being more traditional, and others are more assertive about trade. It makes you think that they must have had a lot of discussions and planning to come up with their strategy. They're trying to approach this from every angle.
So let's talk about what might happen. If India actually does lower these tariffs, especially on agricultural goods, who's going to benefit the most? It seems like American farmers would be the big winners.
Oh, absolutely. Access to a market as huge as India could be a massive opportunity for American agriculture. It could lead to a lot more exports and boost farm incomes. But we also have to think about what might happen in India. If they lower their tariffs, it could mean more competition for Indian farmers from American imports, and that could have some big economic and social impacts.
Right. And then India is going to have to react to whatever the U.S. does, whether it's actually lowering tariffs or putting in place these reciprocal tariffs.
That's a great point. It shows how interconnected everything is in global trade. When a big player like the United States makes a move, everyone else has to figure out what they're going to do about it. India is going to have to consider how the U.S. measures will affect them both economically and politically.
And it all comes back to how confident everyone seems to be about all this. They seem pretty sure that a lot of countries are going to start reducing their tariffs.
Okay.
But the real question is this potential move by India, if it actually happens possibly, a real change in how they approach trade in the long term?
Or is it just
Right.
a way of negotiating, like in the art of the deal?
Exactly. Is it a genuine shift in their trade policy or just a reaction to pressure?
Yeah.
We also have to consider the political situation in both countries. Trade decisions aren't just about economics. They can be very political, and there are a lot of internal factors that can influence them. So let's recap. We've talked about the possibility of India lowering its tariffs on American agricultural goods. We've talked about the U.S. planning to put in place these reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. And we've talked about how all of this is part of a bigger push for fairer trade relationships.
Right. We also talked about those specific examples of high tariffs on American products and how determined the White House seems to be to change things.
And we talked about how no one really knows all the details yet. We don't know exactly how much India might lower its tariffs or what the U.S.'s reciprocal tariffs will look like. It could have a big impact on both the American and Indian economies, depending on what happens.
Absolutely. There's still a lot we don't know.
So here's what I want you to think about. International trade negotiations can be really complicated, and they can drag on for a long time.
Yeah.
So given all that, and given what both the U.S. and India have said, what do you think is most likely to happen after April 2nd? And looking past the headlines, what could this all mean for global trade in the long run? It's a complicated situation, and the effects could last for a long time.
It really is. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Definitely. Thanks for breaking it all down.
No problem.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive.
Look at that.
Bye.